This is the Canon EOS R7. I bought this about 4 months ago and have been using it as my exclusive photo camera during that time. I've taken roughly 60,000 photos on this camera with the kit lens, the Sigma 18-35, and the Sigma 70-200. So in this video, I'll be telling you my experience with this camera and if it's worth the price. So let's get into it. First off, I bought this camera with the kit lens for around $1,800, and the reason that I bought the kit lens was at the time I couldn't buy the camera body itself. So if I were to do it again, I would probably not buy the kit lens, but if you don't have a lot of lenses, it is a good option because of its flexibility. It is a kit lens, so it's not the greatest in quality, but it's decent. You can buy the camera by itself for $1,500, and that is $500 more than the Canon R10, and it's a little bit below the Canon R6. So it's in that sweet spot where it's not the cheapest series, and it's not a full-frame expensive body. Now with that, the sensor is physically smaller, and doesn't perform as well in low light as the R6 and R5 and so on. So that is something to consider, but there is an advantage to having a smaller sensor. Crop sensor lenses work well, and if you want a lot of zoom, using full frame glass with an adapter or even native glass gives you more range. So it can be either upside or a downside. Now this has a 32.5 megapixel sensor, so that is a great advantage over the R10 and means photos are sharp. Now what's funny about this is this camera has more megapixels than the R6, which is a more expensive full frame camera. So that's kind of interesting. But of course it's less than the 48 megapixels that the R5 has. But this is a completely different price bracket than those cameras, so there are a lot more differences than just that. Let's talk about my experience using it. It's light and compact, and the battery lasts for many hours depending on what you're doing. I roughly get 5 to 6 hours when using this camera, going off and on between recording video and photos. It has an RF mount, so you can use RF glass like this lens right here, or I use the RF to EF converter to use my Sigma lenses, which I mostly use with this camera. Now as far as storage goes, this camera has 2 SD card slots, and I've been using most of the time this Angelbird card. Now this is a kind of overkill for this camera. It can way exceed the right speed that the camera can push to it, but pulling photos off of it is really fast, and I needed this to work with my Blackmagic Pocket 6K. Now as far as redundant recording, this camera can do that either on one card then the next, or both cards at the same time, or one card for photos and one card for videos. So there's a lot of flexibility there. You can use a range of SD cards from UHS-1 to UHS-2, and all SD cards should work with this camera. Now as far as monitoring the videos and photos, there's a EVF at the top, as well as a 3.5-inch touchscreen, which is the standard flip-out kind, like this. I love having this, and it works well if you're wanting to hold it out in front of you and see yourself vlogging, and if you're holding it like above you or below you, it really is nice to have a flip-out screen. Now all the Canon R series cameras have this, so there isn't any difference between this flip-out screen and the other ones. But it's a great flip-out screen nonetheless. Now as far as audio inputs go, it has a 3.5mm headphone jack for an external microphone, and it records 16-bit AAC or linear PMC. Now it has a micro HDMI out, which is terrible. I wish it had full HDMI out. I do not have the adapter, so I haven't been able to test that out, but it can output from 1080p to 4K out of the port itself. Additionally, it has a USB-C port, which you can use to charge the battery, but it does not charge when the camera is on. Also, the port can be used to pull files from the SD cards, as well as hooking it up to the EOS webcam utility app to get a live camera feed from this camera. Now, the base version of that app is free, but only allows you to do 720p, so if you want to do anything higher than that, you'll need to upgrade to the professional version. There's also a trigger in, so you can set up a remote to trigger photos and videos, and a headphone output. Now, another advantage of this camera has over the R10 is the built-in stabilization, and that is where the sensor actually moves to stabilize the image. It has 5-axis stabilization, so it can move in every direction, and it works pretty well. Now with certain wide lenses, there is some wobbliness on the edges of that, so that's something to consider. It's very similar to all the Canon cameras, but because the sensor is smaller, it is not as visible as the other full frame cameras. Other than that, most of the features are standard across all the other Canon cameras, and there's so many little features to this camera that I won't be able to tell you all of them in this short video. Now as far as my everyday use, it's worked well in all conditions. I've used it in the rain and in very hot temperatures, and haven't had a single issue with that. The only issue that I've had is a couple times when shooting a lot of photos or videos and switching modes very fast, it will tell me that I need to turn off the camera and turn it back on again, and there is a slight error that had occurred. This isn't the worst issue in the world, and is totally fixable by just turning off the camera and turning it back on again. Autofocus is fast and works well, and this camera has all the autofocus features from the Canon R3. So as far as autofocus goes, it works well with the kit lens or any other lenses that have autofocus. As far as video goes, it's very sharp, and what it can do is take the 7K sensor and oversample it to 4K, so it's much sharper than any other 4K sensors. And that works quite well. Now that only works at 30 frames a second, but this camera can do 4K at 60 or 1080p at 120 frames a second. Just make sure that if you're using these higher codecs to have an SD card that can support it. Slower SD cards can't keep up with the bitrate, so make sure to consider that when buying this camera. Now as far as bitrates with photos go, it has a built-in cache and can store the photos internally and write them to the card, so it doesn't matter what speed the card is, it just depends on how fast you want the buffer to empty. Overall, this camera is priced well and meets my expectations in every way. I haven't had any major issues, and I think it's definitely worth the price, especially over the R10. Now there are some other cameras that do perform better in video than this, but this is a great hybrid camera if you're wanting to do photos and video. For example, the Blackmagic Pocket's 4K will perform better in video than this camera, but that's a completely different use case. So it just depends on what you're wanting to get. I would say that this camera is the best all-around camera if you want to do photos and videos, and has all the features that you would need for most applications. So here's a quick montage of video filmed on this camera. Well, that's pretty much it for this video. If you have any questions about this camera or any of the other equipment I used, please leave it in the comments below and I will answer your question. That's it for this video, and thank you for watching.